Hey guys, today we're diving into a topic that might make you think twice about your next meal, Neanderthal cuisine. Picture this. You're walking through a dense, prehistoric forest, your senses alert to every rustle and crunch beneath your feet. The air is thick with the scent of wood and earth, and you can almost taste the wildness of the world around you. In the distance, you see a group of Neanderthals huddled around a fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on their faces. They're roasting a big chunk of meat, probably something they just hunted. No seasoning, no fancy side dishes, just raw sustenance to survive another day. And let's be real, you probably won't survive this if you're not okay with a diet that's basically all meat, all the time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love hearing from where you guys are tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, here's the deal: Neanderthals weren't picky eaters. While they had access to a variety of foods, they were heavy meat eaters. They didn't exactly have a farmer's market with leafy greens or a variety of grains to choose from. What they did have were big, hungry carnivores to feed. Meat, from large game like mammoths and bison to smaller prey, formed the backbone of their diet. Early humans and Neanderthals were predators by nature, and hunting was the primary way they secured food. But they didn't have the luxury of refrigerators or fancy kitchens. Everything had to be prepared on the spot. You can imagine, even if they had tools and fire, their meals were probably a bit, well, rustic. Their food wasn't the kind of thing we'd find in a gourmet restaurant. Still, survival was the goal, and they made the best of what they had. So, let's dive deeper into what the Neanderthals were really eating, and why, at times, it wasn't exactly what we'd consider delicious. While meat made up the majority of the Neanderthal diet, it wasn't just about devouring any animal that crossed their path. They were strategic hunters, taking down large game like mammoths, bison, and even woolly rhinoceroses. But let's be honest, these weren't just meals that popped up out of nowhere. Getting that much meat on the table wasn't easy. Neanderthals had to rely on a combination of skill, brute force, and possibly even teamwork to bring down such large, dangerous prey. Hunting large game was no small feat. Sometimes it meant taking on animals that were nearly as big as they were. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals hunted in organized groups or if they used more solitary methods. Some believe they were highly cooperative hunters, working together to trap or ambush prey. Others argue that they may have hunted more independently or used simple tools like spears and rocks to take down their food. Regardless of the method, hunting was a risky business. The more massive the prey, the greater the risk of injury. It's not hard to imagine that a spear to the wrong place could mean the difference between dinner and disaster. And let's not forget, those big mammoths didn't just magically disappear into their shelters for an easy meal. The process of butchering an animal of that size had to be a daunting task, especially without the proper tools. Early humans didn't have knives as we know them. Most of their tools were made from stone, bone, or wood and were often quite crude. You can imagine that cutting through thick, tough hides, muscle, and bone using primitive tools was a tedious job. It was less about elegance and more about getting enough food to survive. While large game was certainly the meat of choice, early humans didn't only rely on the big hunt. As much as Neanderthals loved their protein-packed meals, they also supplemented their diet with smaller animals, like birds, rabbits, and other smaller mammals. In fact, some archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthals would sometimes resort to scavenging, picking through the remains of other predators' kills. But again, even when they weren't the ones doing the hunting, the process still had its challenges. Scavenging wasn't exactly a five-star dining experience. They had to deal with the possibility of competition. Other predators, like wolves or big cats, could be just as interested in the carcass. But despite the occasional variety, the Neanderthal diet was pretty limited in its variety. There weren't any nice salads, grains, or fruit smoothies on the menu. If the animals they hunted weren't available, Neanderthals had to get creative with whatever else was within reach. So, besides hunting and scavenging, what else was there? Historians still debate just how much plant material Neanderthals actually consumed. Some believe that Neanderthals were strictly carnivores, while others suggest that they supplemented their diet with some plant-based foods. Archaeological evidence has uncovered traces of plant remains, including seeds, tubers, and other edible vegetation in Neanderthal hearths. But the evidence is sparse and often inconclusive. It's safe to say that plants weren't a mainstay of their diet, and any veggies they did eat likely came from whatever was available in their immediate surroundings, like wild roots, berries, or leafy greens. Despite the limited variety, Neanderthals made the best of what they had. Their meat-heavy diet may have been effective in terms of survival, but it wasn't always the most nutritious. Their reliance on large game meant that they were likely consuming a lot of protein and fat, but they weren't getting much in the way of vitamins and minerals. As a result, it's possible that Neanderthals may have suffered from nutritional deficiencies, scurvy, for instance, which is caused by a lack of vitamin C, might have been a problem. So, while their diet may have been packed with calories, it wasn't necessarily a balanced one. The challenges of surviving on a meat-heavy diet without the nutritional benefits of plants were real. Still, it didn't stop Neanderthals from thriving for thousands of years. They adapted to their environment in ways that allowed them to survive harsh conditions and unpredictable climates. It wasn't about delicious meals, it was about making do with what they had and ensuring that every meal contributed to the survival of the group. But let's face it, for early humans, meals weren't about flavor. They were about survival. The food they ate was functional, it kept them alive and fueled them for the day ahead. It's not that they didn't appreciate a good meal, but they weren't exactly concerned with how delicious their dinner tasted. Survival, for them, wasn't about gourmet cuisine. It was about efficiency, practicality, and getting enough to keep going. So, while Neanderthals had to make do with what they had, their hunting and eating habits were not all about convenience. These early humans didn't exactly have the luxury of a neatly prepared meal. It was raw, it was tough, and it was often hard work just to get food on the table. Let's talk about the not-so-delicious side of their diet, the parts of the animal that we'd rather not touch with a 10-foot spear. For one, Neanderthals didn't have modern-day butchering methods, and this meant they had to work with what they had. When they brought down a mammoth, or whatever large animal they were hunting, there wasn't much choice in what parts they could eat. Everything from the organs to the tough muscle was fair game. The meat might have been a bit gamey, tough, and chewy. And the organs, well, we're talking liver, heart, kidneys, and intestines. These parts weren't exactly the prime cuts. Not everyone's idea of a gourmet dinner. Yet, these parts were packed with nutrients, which was crucial when your life depended on getting every last bit of sustenance from your food. Historians still debate how much of this offal Neanderthals actually ate. Some believe that they didn't waste anything. If they were hunting for large game, they likely consumed everything they could, from the fatty marrow to the more unpleasant organs. Others think that the Neanderthals may have been more selective, preferring the muscle meat and leaving the less desirable parts behind. One thing is for sure, whatever they ate, it wasn't always the delicious cuts of meat we've come to enjoy today. If you think about it, you're probably not having a feast of mammoth liver and heart on your birthday dinner table. But for Neanderthals, it was a matter of necessity. No part of the animal went to waste. But it wasn't just the organs that made their meals less than appetizing. The process of cooking, or rather, the lack of sophisticated cooking techniques, made things even harder. Early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did have fire, which was essential for cooking and preserving food, but their cooking methods were likely very primitive. Think of it as roasting over an open flame. The meat might have been tough and charred on the outside, while still being raw and chewy inside. No slow-cooked, melt-in-your-mouth meat here. Neanderthals didn't have the luxury of ovens or anything that resembled a proper kitchen. They didn't know how to tenderize meat like we do with modern techniques. If they were cooking large game, the meat was probably pretty tough, and they may have resorted to eating it with little more than fire-roasted flavor and basic seasoning, if any at all. But here's the kicker. Neanderthals didn't just rely on meat. They knew the value of foraging for plants, nuts, berries, and roots, but let's be real, it wasn't always a tasty alternative. The plant-based part of their diet was limited, as we know from archaeological findings. Sure, they might have occasionally snacked on some wild berries, tubers, or leaves, but these weren't the gourmet meals we think of when we imagine farm-to-table dining. The berries were likely small, tart, and seasonal, certainly not the juicy, sweet fruit we're accustomed to today. And roots? They might have been edible, but they were probably rough, bitter, and needed a lot of work to prepare. Their plant-based food options were functional, providing needed vitamins and fiber, but far from appetizing. Historians still debate how much Neanderthals actually foraged for plant-based foods. Some believe they were more reliant on these plant sources than we think, but the evidence suggests that, while they might have foraged, meat was still the dominant food source. Others believe that Neanderthals might have even used their tools to dig up roots, although this wasn't a primary means of sustenance. It seems clear that, while they did eat some plants, they weren't getting the same variety or nutritional benefits we have from modern agriculture. As much as early humans and Neanderthals were adapting to their environments, their food choices weren't always about taste, they were about survival. When you're fighting against the elements, running from predators, and hunting for food to feed your group, the last thing you're worried about is whether it's going to be a Michelin-starred meal. You make do with what you can find, eat what's available, and cook it in the simplest way possible. If the meat's tough, you chew harder. If the roots are bitter, you swallow quicker. Survival doesn't leave much room for picky eaters. At the end of the day, what's important is that Neanderthals were incredibly resourceful. They didn't have the luxury of choosing what tasted the best. They made their meals work for them, maximizing every bit of nutrition they could extract from what was available. So, while their meals may not have been the most delicious by modern standards, they were, in many ways, perfectly suited to the challenges they faced. You've probably got the idea by now that Neanderthal meals weren't exactly fine dining. But their food choices went beyond just being about tough, gamey meat and occasionally foraged roots. The reality of surviving in the Ice Age with such limited food options meant that the Neanderthal diet was all about adaptability. Their environment was harsh and the available resources were scarce, so their approach to food was less about choosing the tastiest options and more about surviving with what they had. One of the key factors that made their diet so challenging was the limited range of food sources. While early Homo sapiens had the ability to forage for a wide variety of plants, fruits, and grains as the environment evolved, Neanderthals were much more restricted in what they could gather. Their knowledge of plant-based foods was limited, and the climate they lived in wasn't as conducive to growing a wide variety of edible plants. The Ice Age wasn't exactly a thriving Garden of Eden. It was a time of cold, harsh climates, where the abundance of edible vegetation wasn't always there. While they may have occasionally scavenged for berries, tubers, and leaves, these foods were often seasonal, unpredictable, and often bitter or bland. Imagine finding a patch of wild herbs in a forest, only to discover that they weren't the tasty herbs we know today. They were sour, tough, or even mildly poisonous. You'd eat them only if you really had no choice, and that's pretty much the story for Neanderthals when it came to plant-based meals. Historians still argue over how much Neanderthals relied on plants. Some believe that their diet was more varied than we give them credit for, pointing to plant remains discovered at Neanderthal sites, suggesting they ate more than just meat. But others suggest that plants were merely a backup, a supplementary food source when the meat was scarce or when hunting didn't go as planned. It's likely that Neanderthals ate more meat than plants, but they didn't have the same access to the wide range of edible plants that later Homo sapiens would have when they started to experiment with agriculture. Let's talk about the actual hunting process for a moment. Neanderthals were certainly skilled hunters, but they didn't always hunt the most appetizing creatures. Sure, they went after large game like mammoths and bison, but their diet was sometimes filled with the less desirable cuts of meat. Think about it. After a big hunt, Neanderthals weren't going to waste any part of the animal. They needed to extract every ounce of nutrition possible, so even the less than appealing cuts were fair game. The fatty marrow, the tough hide, and even the intestines would have been consumed. Imagine trying to get through a tough, sinewy tendon from a mammoth's leg or chomping on a piece of meat that still had traces of gristle. For us, these aren't the things we crave when we think about a good meal, but for Neanderthals, they were the difference between survival and starvation. That said, not all Neanderthal food came from large game. Their diet also included smaller prey, like rabbits, birds, and fish. But here's the thing, hunting small animals wasn't easy. These creatures were quick, and catching them with the primitive tools available would have been no small feat. Fishing was also a tricky business. Neanderthals didn't have fishing rods, nets, or the refined techniques we use today. They probably used basic spears or even their hands to catch fish, and often in environments that weren't ideal for fishing, rivers that might have been muddy, fast-moving, or frozen over for part of the year. When we think of a Neanderthal dinner, it's easy to imagine a feast of freshly roasted meat, juicy and tender. But in reality, their meals were often far more humble and less delicious. The meat was likely tough, the plants were scarce and bland, and there was very little variety. Despite their hunting prowess, Neanderthals often had to make do with what they could find, which meant adapting to a diet that wasn't always filling or appetizing. And let's be honest, they didn't have spices, seasoning, or the culinary innovations that we take for granted today. What Neanderthals ate wasn't just food, it was survival. The act of eating wasn't about satisfying a craving, it was about ensuring you had enough fuel to face another day. Their diet, though, wasn't necessarily unhealthy by their standards. The reliance on high-protein meat provided them with the calories needed to survive in the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, and the occasional plant-based food likely helped provide essential vitamins and minerals. The key word here is survival. They ate to stay alive, not necessarily to enjoy a balanced, gourmet meal. Still, it's not hard to imagine that, when the hunt was successful, there were moments of celebration around the fire. The taste of fresh meat, even if tough, would have been a welcome change from the often bland and repetitive diet of their day-to-day lives. But for the most part, early humans and Neanderthals were focused on the practicality of their meals. They made do with what they had, and in a world full of uncertainty, that was all they could do. Neanderthals, despite their strength and prowess as hunters, also had to face the realities of what they were actually eating. While they often hunted large animals like mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses, their diet wasn't always limited to the prime cuts of these creatures. The process of butchering these large animals was no simple task. With primitive tools and techniques, Neanderthals had to carve up massive carcasses, and in doing so, they would have had to consume every part of the animal to make sure no valuable calories went to waste. This means the less appetizing cuts, like tough muscle, bone marrow, and even organs, were often part of the regular diet. Now, picture yourself hunched over a mammoth carcass with nothing but stone tools, skinning it and then gnawing on the tough cuts that require a lot of chewing and effort. The idea of eating mammoth liver, kidneys, or intestines doesn't sound like the most gourmet meal, right? But this wasn't a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. These less tasty parts of the animal were packed with nutrients that were vital for the Neanderthal's survival, especially during harsh winters when food could be scarce. Historians still debate how Neanderthals managed to deal with these less-than-delicious meals. Some suggest that they likely had strategies to make these cuts more palatable, such as cooking them over fire to tenderize the meat or using natural processes like drying or smoking to preserve them. Others think they simply ate what they could and focused more on nutritional value rather than taste. Either way, what we know for sure is that their survival wasn't about choosing food based on flavor. It was about making the most of what the environment offered. The heavy reliance on animal products, while providing ample calories, also meant that their diet was far from balanced. Neanderthals likely suffered from nutritional deficiencies, especially since their plant-based food sources were limited. The Ice Age environment wasn't ideal for cultivating crops or gathering a wide variety of edible plants. Sure, they could forage for berries, roots, and tubers, but these were seasonal and often far from abundant. What they ate from the plant world wasn't always enough to compensate for the lack of fiber, vitamins, and minerals. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that Neanderthals might have suffered from diseases like scurvy or other vitamin deficiencies due to their lack of variety in the diet. Without sufficient sources of vitamin C from fruits and vegetables, scurvy could have been a common issue, especially during the winter months when fresh plant food was scarce. While they had the energy to hunt and gather, it's possible that many Neanderthals didn't live long enough to see the long-term effects of a diet lacking in diversity. But despite the struggles, Neanderthals weren't alone in their dietary choices. Early Homo sapiens shared many of the same limitations, and their diets were also largely based on the availability of meat, nuts, and whatever wild plants they could forage. The major difference was that Homo sapiens eventually began to innovate, developing agriculture and more advanced food preservation techniques. Neanderthals, however, didn't make it that far. They lived in a world where, despite their superior hunting skills and adaptation to cold climates, their diets remained largely meat-based and sometimes lacking in essential nutrients. Interestingly, Neanderthals were able to make do in a world where the food they ate wasn't necessarily delicious by modern standards. They understood that survival was about efficiency, getting as much nourishment as possible from the food they had. A steady diet of meat, with occasional wild plant matter, may have been a workable solution, but it wasn't necessarily one that would sustain them in the long run. This reliance on meat and the lack of dietary variety might have even contributed to the eventual decline of Neanderthal populations as they struggled with disease and environmental changes that affected the availability of game. The true question, however, is, did they ever get tired of eating meat, organs, and the rougher parts of their prey? And was there ever a moment when they, perhaps around the fire after a long day's hunt, wished for something a little more flavorful? In the end, Neanderthal survival was about making the best of what they had no matter how unappetizing their meals were. Their diet may not have been gourmet, but it worked for the environment they lived in. For Neanderthals surviving the cold, harsh world wasn't about what tasted the best, it was about what kept them alive. As we continue to peel back the layers of the Neanderthal diet, it becomes clear that their eating habits were influenced by more than just the scarcity of food. Their reliance on meat was largely due to their environment, cold, harsh, and unpredictable, where large, energy-dense animals were a primary food source. But while Neanderthals were skilled hunters, their methods and lifestyle didn't always make food preparation easy, and certainly not delicious by modern standards. Now, let's think about this for a second. Imagine spending hours hunting, tracking down prey, and finally bringing home a large animal. You're exhausted, the adrenaline has worn off, and you're ready to eat. But here's the catch. The food you bring back isn't neatly packaged and prepped. It's raw, it's tough, and it requires quite a bit of effort to consume. Neanderthals didn't have the luxury of tender cuts of meat like we do today. They weren't able to slow cook their food or make juicy steaks. What they ate was more about survival than flavor. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals had the ability to cook their food with any sophistication. The evidence of controlled fire use is clear, and there's no doubt that fire played a crucial role in their survival. However, cooking techniques were primitive by today's standards. Roasting a piece of meat over an open flame would have been far from a fine dining experience. Imagine biting into a piece of tough, undercooked mammoth or bison meat. It probably wouldn't have been something you'd want to repeat every day. Neanderthals likely cooked their food as best they could, but even with fire, their meals were likely chewy and possibly charred on the outside. The concept of marinating meat or adding spices was, of course, out of the question. What about flavor, though? While Neanderthals might have used fire to cook some of their food, they didn't have the luxury of seasoning it to make it taste better. Salt, herbs, and spices were not part of their culinary repertoire. So their diet, while rich in protein and fat, was also incredibly bland. Imagine eating the same tough cuts of meat and some wild plants over and over again, with no way to add variety or flavor. Even though they may have enjoyed the feeling of a successful hunt, the lack of seasoning and the nature of their food must have made meals feel more like a necessity than a pleasure. Their ability to manage this blandness, however, was part of their survival. Neanderthals weren't focused on flavor, they were focused on energy. They needed calorie-dense food to survive in harsh climates and to support the intense physical exertion required by their lifestyle. Meat provided the necessary nutrients, protein, and fat that kept them going, especially during the cold winters when food might be harder to find. That said, there was still a limit to how much meat their bodies could process. The constant reliance on a diet high in protein and fat likely led to nutritional deficiencies, particularly in vitamins and minerals that would have been found in plants. Despite the challenges of a limited diet, Neanderthals didn't have much choice in the matter. They ate to survive, and they ate what was available. The reliance on large game provided them with a steady food source, but it also meant that they had to work incredibly hard to hunt and prepare the food. This required teamwork, skill, and strategy. Hunting wasn't just about the thrill, it was about the energy it provided and the success of bringing enough food back to sustain the group. When the hunt was successful, there was likely a great sense of accomplishment. But that success didn't mean they were going to enjoy a lavish feast. It meant that they had food, raw and unrefined, that would sustain them for a time. Neanderthals, then, were not concerned with the pleasures of eating. They were focused on the essentials, getting the right amount of calories to fuel their bodies. Their survival depended on their ability to gather what they needed from a hostile environment, and the food they consumed was merely a means to an end. As humans evolved and began to develop new ways of gathering food, they would eventually learn how to cook and season food in ways that made meals not just functional, but enjoyable. But for the Neanderthals, the experience of eating was a far cry from the gourmet meals we enjoy today. And despite the lack of flavor, the lack of variety, and the sometimes tough texture of their meals, it's clear that the Neanderthal diet worked. They thrived in the cold, harsh climates for thousands of years, and their dietary choices were a key part of that success. In the end, Neanderthals weren't concerned with eating delicious meals. They were focused on survival, plain and simple. They made do with what they had, and their ability to adapt to a diet of mostly meat, supplemented with the occasional plants, allowed them to become one of the most successful species in prehistoric times. As we continue to examine the diet of Neanderthals, we begin to understand more about how they coped with the limitations of their food sources. The idea of survival was central to their way of life. Every meal was about sustaining the body for the harsh conditions they faced. As we've seen, meat played a crucial role in their diet, but the world they inhabited was not just about hunting large mammals. There were also smaller prey, plants, and other foraged items that provided variety, albeit not always the tastiest or most enjoyable. While Neanderthals were clearly skilled hunters, they didn't just eat mammoths and bison. Their diets also included smaller animals, rabbits, birds, and rodents. But let's be real, these were far from the juicy steaks and tender roasts that we're used to today. Smaller game wasn't easy to catch either. These animals were faster, smarter, and much harder to trap than the large, slow-moving mammoths. Neanderthals likely relied on a combination of hunting, tracking, and perhaps even using rudimentary traps to catch their prey. The meat from smaller animals was probably leaner and tougher, and their bones, though useful, required careful preparation. For early humans, hunting and foraging for small game wasn't a luxury. It was a way to fill in the gaps when larger prey wasn't available. Historians still debate how often Neanderthals hunted small game compared to larger mammals. Some argue that the hunt for big animals like mammoths was the primary food source, while others suggest that small game may have been a more consistent, albeit less glamorous, part of their diet. Given the unpredictability of the Ice Age environment, it's likely that Neanderthals adapted by hunting whatever was available, whether that meant chasing down large prey or setting traps for smaller animals. Either way, survival was key and every meal counted. The real question, though, is whether they enjoyed eating small game at all. The meat from smaller animals wasn't exactly appetizing by modern standards. It was tougher, gamier, and likely harder to digest than the larger, fattier cuts of meat from mammoths. Yet, Neanderthals didn't have the luxury of picky eating. They ate what they could catch, trap, or find. Even if it wasn't delicious, it was necessary for survival. Beyond the meat, Neanderthals also had to rely on whatever they could forage. Plants were a supplementary part of their diet, but these weren't the lush, edible gardens we might imagine today. Their environment was harsh and not conducive to cultivating large quantities of edible plants. Instead, Neanderthals likely foraged for wild roots, tubers, berries, and leafy greens. But let's not romanticize it, the plants they found weren't necessarily sweet or abundant. These foods were likely bitter and tough to eat, and certainly not as nutritious or delicious as the fruits and vegetables we enjoy today. Their plant-based diet was limited by what was available in the wild, and these foods didn't provide the variety or abundance that early humans would have needed to maintain a balanced diet. Historians still debate how much Neanderthals depended on plants. Some research suggests that plant consumption was more common than we once thought, especially during colder months when hunting might not be as successful. Other studies point to the fact that Neanderthals didn't have the same agricultural practices as later humans, making plant-based foods a relatively small part of their diet. Even so, the occasional berry or root might have provided much-needed vitamins and minerals, though not enough to make up for the heavy reliance on meat. Neanderthals, however, didn't have much of a choice in the matter. Their world didn't offer the luxury of food variety. They ate what they could, even if it wasn't delicious. And they were incredibly resourceful in making the best of what they had. They were skilled at utilizing every part of the animals they hunted. Nothing went to waste. Bone marrow, skin, tendons, and fat were all used for food, tools, or shelter. What might seem unappetizing to us was a lifeline for them. They knew how to extract the maximum amount of nutrition from what they had, even if the food wasn't easy on the palate. It was all about survival. So, while Neanderthal meals may not have been the most delicious by our standards, they were essential to the daily fight for survival. The meat was rich in fat and protein, providing the energy needed to sustain their physically demanding lifestyles. The plants, though limited, offered necessary nutrients to keep the body balanced. And the food, while not always appetizing, was always functional. The focus wasn't on flavor, it was on staying alive and doing whatever it took to keep moving forward. Neanderthal food wasn't gourmet, but it worked. They made do with what they had, adjusting their hunting techniques, foraging practices, and cooking methods to thrive in a world that was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. Their ability to survive with a limited and sometimes unappetizing diet is a testament to their adaptability. They didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to ensure that they could wake up the next day, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As we continue to explore the dietary habits of Neanderthals, it's clear that their approach to food was about more than just surviving. It was about adapting to a constantly changing world. The food they consumed may not have been tasty, but it was functional. Survival was their top priority, and they knew that their ability to adapt their diet to the changing environment was key. But this reliance on a meat-heavy diet, with occasional foraging for plants, wasn't just about physical endurance. It shaped their entire way of life, from social structures to culture and even their health. One of the more interesting aspects of the Neanderthal diet is the role that their heavy meat consumption played in shaping their social dynamics. In a tribe of early humans, food wasn't just about nourishment. It was a vital part of the social fabric. Neanderthals, like other early hominids, likely shared meals in their small, tight-knit groups. Sharing food, especially after a successful hunt, was a way of bonding, cementing social relationships, and ensuring cooperation within the group. A big hunt, bringing in a large animal like a mammoth, wasn't just about feeding the tribe, it was a communal event. Everyone played a part in the butchering, sharing, and preparation of the food. Historians still argue about the extent to which Neanderthals participated in social behaviors similar to modern humans, such as cooperative food sharing. Some evidence suggests that Neanderthals shared food regularly within their groups, just as Homo sapiens did, indicating the importance of collective survival. Others propose that Neanderthals may have been more individualistic in their hunting practices, with a greater focus on solo hunts. However, it's likely that, just like other early humans, Neanderthals depended on group cooperation to bring down large game, making food sharing a natural part of their existence. But what about the less glamorous side of their food sharing culture? Sharing tough, stringy meat, boiled organs, and marrow could have been a less than pleasant experience. Imagine gnawing on tough mammoth hide or scraping meat off a bone with crude stone tools. It wasn't the kind of meal where everyone gathered around a table with plates full of nicely cooked steaks. The shared meal was often raw, unrefined, and required significant effort to get through. Yet, despite the lack of culinary sophistication, food sharing was a critical element of survival. Without cooperation, early humans, including Neanderthals, would have struggled to gather enough food in a world that didn't always provide. Even if the meals weren't delicious, they were necessary, and eating together helped solidify the social bonds that kept the group intact. But food sharing also introduced its own set of challenges. With a diet so heavily dependent on hunting large game, Neanderthals had to deal with the risk of going hungry if their hunt was unsuccessful. While they may have occasionally scavenged or foraged for plants, the meat-heavy diet meant that if a hunt failed, food could be scarce. This reliance on meat, and the communal aspect of sharing it, meant that groups had to rely on their hunting success, and a failed hunt could have significant consequences for the group as a whole. A lack of food could lead to social tensions or even conflict, especially if some individuals were able to bring in more meat than others. In a world where food was often the difference between life and death, these challenges made early humans' ability to share food even more essential. If one person failed to bring back food or couldn't participate in the hunt, they would rely on the generosity of others to survive. The shared meal thus became a way of ensuring that no one in the group was left behind. The Neanderthal diet, while harsh, wasn't just about the physical sustenance. It was about maintaining social cohesion and ensuring the survival of the group. The diet of early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was not just about getting by, it was about making do with what was available, working together, and adapting to the environment. In a world of predators, uncertain weather, and limited food sources, the focus was always on survival, and that meant using whatever tools, resources, and strategies were necessary. It wasn't about flavor, it was about endurance. As the climate continued to change and Neanderthals adapted their diet to the evolving world around them, one thing became clear. They didn't just survive because they could hunt. They survived because they were able to adapt, cooperate, and make the most of what they had. Their ability to make the tough, often unpleasant food sources work for them speaks to the resilience and ingenuity that allowed them to thrive in a constantly changing world. As the world continued to change around them, so too did the dietary habits of Neanderthals. Their reliance on large, fatty animals, while effective in the short term, began to show its limitations. The Ice Age world wasn't going to last forever, and as the climate warmed, the availability of these massive beasts began to decrease. This posed a serious challenge for a species so adapted to a carnivorous diet. The shift in climate meant that not only did the animal populations change, but the environment also altered in ways that required new food strategies. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, Neanderthals found themselves facing an increasingly unpredictable environment. The large herds of mammoths, bison, and other megafauna started to thin out, and new, faster-moving animals replaced them. The landscape itself transformed from a frozen tundra to a more temperate world, bringing with it new plants and smaller animals. Neanderthals had to adapt, but their diet, still heavily focused on meat, wasn't well suited for the more varied resources the changing climate offered. This period of adaptation wasn't easy. Early humans and Neanderthals likely needed to expand their diets, incorporating more plant-based foods into their meals. However, the shift wasn't immediate. There's evidence that Neanderthals did experiment with foraging, but their plant-based diet was always limited. The seeds and berries they could find were often seasonal, and the cold environment didn't support a diverse range of edible plants. Archaeological findings suggest that while they may have consumed some plants, they didn't rely on them as a primary food source. They still hunted and scavenged for meat, but they were beginning to realize that the climate wasn't going to make it easy to sustain their traditional carnivorous lifestyle forever. Historians still debate how much Neanderthals relied on plants compared to animals. Some research indicates that, especially during periods when large game was harder to find, Neanderthals might have turned to more plant-based foods, including roots and tubers. Others argue that their diet remained overwhelmingly meat-based, with plant material playing only a minor role in their nutrition. This debate suggests that while the Neanderthal diet might have been adaptable, it wasn't always healthy or balanced. The heavy reliance on meat, with limited access to other sources of nutrition, might have contributed to some of the health issues faced by Neanderthals, such as poor dental health and potential vitamin deficiencies. Despite these challenges, Neanderthals didn't go hungry. They were adaptable, and even if their diet wasn't as diverse or balanced as ours today, they were able to extract the maximum nutrition from what was available. They understood the value of the meat they ate, and they made the most of every animal they hunted. Bone marrow, organ meats, and even tough, sinewy cuts of meat were all part of their diet. They didn't waste anything, as each part of the animal had its purpose. In the absence of a steady plant-based diet, the nutrient-rich fat, protein, and marrow provided the necessary calories to fuel their physically demanding lifestyle. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all this, they still weren't immune to the downside of their meat-heavy diet. As Neanderthals continued to rely heavily on hunting and meat, they risked facing nutritional imbalances. This wasn't necessarily a huge problem in the short term. They were excellent hunters and had access to a lot of protein-rich food. But over time, the absence of a balanced diet could have caused deficiencies in essential nutrients, particularly vitamins that were more abundant in plants. It's possible that the lack of variety in their diet contributed to issues like scurvy, a lack of vitamin C, or other health problems. As the Neanderthal world changed, their diet had to evolve. They weren't strictly carnivores, but they certainly leaned heavily on animal products. The warmer climate forced them to adapt, either by learning to forage more effectively or by incorporating new types of food into their diet. Whether they evolved to be more flexible in their eating habits or just survived on what was available, the Neanderthal diet proved to be one of the keys to their survival in an unpredictable and changing world. The shift from a strictly meat-based diet to one that incorporated more plant matter marks a significant point in early human adaptation. It shows how survival wasn't just about hunting. It was about being able to adjust to new environments, new animals, and new food sources. But despite all their efforts, it's clear that Neanderthals still didn't have the luxury of choosing what they ate based on taste or pleasure. Their survival depended on their ability to adapt to whatever food was available, and while their meals may not have been gourmet, they got the job done. As we look back at the Neanderthal diet, it's clear that their relationship with food wasn't about enjoyment. It was about making the best of what was available and, above all, about survival. The world they inhabited was unpredictable, harsh, and unforgiving. Neanderthals didn't have the luxury of choosing what they ate. They ate to stay alive, adapting to whatever resources the environment offered. While we may find their diet unappealing or limited, it was perfectly suited to their needs in a world that demanded constant innovation and resilience. Their reliance on meat was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it provided the necessary calories, fat, and protein to fuel their physically demanding lives. Neanderthals, like other early humans, were built for endurance, hunting large game, scavenging, and living in cold, difficult conditions. Meat was a high-calorie food that allowed them to keep up their strength. On the other hand, the lack of variety in their diet likely left them vulnerable to certain health issues. Without a consistent intake of plant-based foods, Neanderthals may have suffered from nutrient deficiencies, such as a lack of vitamin C or other essential vitamins and minerals that came from fruits, vegetables, or more diverse food sources. Despite this, Neanderthals didn't just survive. They thrived in an environment that was constantly changing. They adapted to the loss of large game and the shifting climate, learning to make use of what they had, even if it wasn't the most delicious. Their ability to adapt is a testament to their resilience. They were capable of adjusting to the landscape around them, whether that meant shifting their hunting strategies, incorporating more plants into their diet, or developing tools to make the most out of every animal they brought down. It's also important to remember that Neanderthals were not alone in their dietary struggles. Early Homo sapiens, too, were primarily carnivorous and lived in a world where their meals were often as much about survival as enjoyment. It wasn't until later in human evolution, with the advent of agriculture and the development of more advanced food preparation techniques, that humans started to have the luxury of a varied and balanced diet. Neanderthals, in their time, had no such luxury. But what is truly fascinating is that while their diet may seem plain and lacking in variety, it laid the groundwork for human innovation and adaptability. The shift toward incorporating more plant-based foods, when available, helped set the stage for later human advancements in agriculture and food cultivation. The ability to adapt to the environment, the animals, and the seasons was crucial for survival, and Neanderthals were masters at it. Though we may not admire the flavor or diversity of the Neanderthal diet, we can certainly appreciate their ability to survive under such difficult conditions. They didn't need gourmet meals or variety. They needed sustenance, and they found ways to get it, using their environment to their advantage. The Neanderthal diet was a key factor in their ability to thrive during the Ice Age, and it left a lasting legacy for future human societies to build on. So, the next time you sit down for a delicious meal, maybe take a moment to think about those first humans. They didn't have the luxury of choosing what to eat based on taste. They ate based on necessity, survival, and the environment that surrounded them. What we see as an unappetizing diet was their way of life, and without it, they might not have made it to the next stage of human evolution. Despite the challenges, the Neanderthals adapted and thrived, proving that sometimes survival isn't about luxury or flavor. It's about making do with what you have and using everything at your disposal.